Imagine offering your hand in respect and being treated like you didn't even exist. No handshake, no eye contact, just silence, heavy and deliberate. That's exactly what happened when millionaire Evelyn Whitemore turned her back on Lydia Ellis in a crowded room of executives. To everyone else, it looked like a casual snub. But what they didn't know was this. The woman Evelyn dismissed held the keys to a $5 billion empire. Within 24 hours, that empire would begin to crumble. Not with noise, but with silence returned. Stay with me, because the truth behind this story will leave you questioning how much a single moment of arrogance can cost. The room had been alive with chatter, silverware chiming against porcelain, voices layered with laughter and calculated charm. Deals worth millions were whispered between sips of champagne, and futures were being sealed in the quiet exchange of handshakes. That was the rhythm of Evelyn Whitemore's world. A place where arrogance wore pearls and power gleamed in a smile polished for the cameras. Yet on that morning, beneath the chandeliers of the Harrington Club, one refusal, one moment of quiet cruelty, cut through the air sharper than any deal signed on paper. Lydia Ellis stood tall, composed, her navy suit crisp against her skin, the kind of presence that drew respect without a single word. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was the reason every person in that room had gathered, the silent current flowing beneath the billion-dollar project that Evelyn paraded as her crowning achievement. But no one knew that yet. What they saw was a black woman, dignified, confident, and extending her hand in courtesy. What they witnessed next would mark the unraveling of an empire. Evelyn's eyes flickered to Lydia, scanning her from head to toe with a practiced indifference that felt like ice melting across skin. For the briefest second, Lydia's hand hovered in the air, waiting. It was the most human of gestures, an offering, a bridge, a moment of equality. But Evelyn didn't take it. She didn't even acknowledge it. Instead, she turned, pivoted on heels that cost more than a laborer's month of wages, and clasped the hands of Richard Hale and another executive standing nearby. She laughed too loudly at their jokes, her bracelets catching the light, while Lydia's hand remained suspended between them, alone, unanswered. A silence fell. Not the heavy kind that announces disaster, but the brittle kind that pretends not to exist. A few eyes darted to the scene, lips pressed thin, heads quickly turning away as though denial could erase what had happened. Richard's glance lingered for half a beat, discomfort passing across his face, before he too followed Evelyn's laughter like a moth to flame. Olivia Reed, seated across the table, shifted in her chair, her jaw tightening, but like the rest she said nothing. No one ever did in Evelyn Whitemore's world. Lydia lowered her hand with a grace that burned deeper than any outburst. She didn't force a smile, didn't mutter a word. Her silence was deliberate, her composure unshaken. But inside something stirred, not anger, not surprise. It was calculation. She had seen this before, in boardrooms where her ideas were claimed by louder voices, in corridors where her presence was overlooked until someone realized the numbers, the brilliance, the undeniable force behind her work bore her name. She had carried these scars for years, each slight weaving into a tapestry of quiet strength. What Evelyn saw as weakness was nothing less than a storm waiting for its moment. The air shifted after that, subtle but unmissable. Conversations thinned, laughter faltered, and though the brunch carried on, the energy felt altered, as if everyone present knew they had witnessed something significant. Not because Evelyn had refused a handshake, such indignities happen daily, often ignored, but because of who Lydia Ellis truly was. The room didn't know it yet, but the balance of power had just changed hands. Evelyn basked in her performance, her voice carrying above the rest as she spoke of vision, innovation, and the monumental $5 billion project her firm was undertaking. She believed herself untouchable, too blinded by the mirrors of her own wealth to notice that the very foundation beneath her feet was shifting. The snub had been so casual, so dismissive, that it might have passed as nothing more than a ripple in the social tide. But in that ripple lay the crack that would split her empire open. Lydia remained quiet, sipping her tea, her expression unreadable, her mind already working ahead. She did not need to announce herself, did not need to command the room. True power, she had learned long ago, was rarely loud. It moved silently like deep water, unseen until its force swallowed everything above. She had come to this brunch out of courtesy, to extend her hand in partnership, to meet the woman whose public face carried a project she herself had chosen to finance. And in return, she had been dismissed like she did not exist. That single gesture, denying a handshake, was not just an insult. It was a mirror reflecting centuries of dismissal, layered in wealth and polished arrogance. The cruelty of it was not in Evelyn's turning away, but in the ease with which she did it. No hesitation, no pause, no thought that the woman standing before her could be more than the color of her skin or the absence of a last name with weight. That ease was what burned into the witnesses, into the hearts of those who dared glance at Lydia and then quickly look away. And though Evelyn's laugh carried across the table, though the room carried on its script of wealth and promise, there was no undoing the moment. Because what no one in that room knew, what Evelyn herself hadn't cared to know, was that Lydia Ellis was not there to be acknowledged. She was the one who had written the checks, who had supplied the lifeblood of capital without which Evelyn's grand stage would have been empty. She was the silent architect of the empire Evelyn claimed as her own. And within 24 hours, the balance of that empire would collapse, not with noise, but with the same kind of silence Evelyn had shown her. The cameras at the back of the room clicked on, photographers capturing Evelyn's smile, her handshakes, her charm. None turned toward Lydia. But history has always had a way of correcting its lens. And when it did, when the truth came to light, the world would remember the moment Evelyn Whitemore turned her back on the very hand that held her fortune in its palm. The brunch ended as if nothing extraordinary had happened, at least to those who preferred to pretend. Plates were cleared. The echo of laughter lingered in the hallways, and Evelyn Whitemore floated through the crowd with the ease of a woman who believed the world existed to admire her. Lydia Ellis, however, walked out without fanfare, her steps steady, her eyes fixed not on the marble floors beneath her but on the storm she knew was beginning to take shape. She had long understood that the most devastating moments of change often begin quietly. That handshake, refused so effortlessly, wasn't simply about her. It was about the endless line of people like her who had been dismissed, disregarded, and written out of rooms they themselves had financed. It was the weight of history condensed into a single moment. Lydia's story had not been born in ballrooms or country clubs. Her roots ran through classrooms where she had been the only black student, where her brilliance was often overshadowed by the biases of teachers who saw potential in others before they saw it in her. She had learned early to let the silence shape her strength. Every condescending smile, every time her words were spoken back to her as though they were someone else's, every subtle exclusion became fuel for her resolve. Years later, when she earned her doctorate in economics, she did not celebrate loudly. She simply placed her degree on the wall and reminded herself that power could be earned quietly, without the validation of those who tried to ignore her. It was this very discipline, this mastery of patience and calculation, that had built her reputation as one of the most formidable investors in the country. While others clamored for attention and headlines, Lydia worked in the background, building industries rather than just companies. She had funded renewable energy before it was fashionable, built housing initiatives that kept families afloat during economic collapse, and structured financial models that turned failing ventures into thriving empires. Yet she never claimed the spotlight. Her reward was in the work itself, in the subtle ripple of change that spread outward because of her decisions. Evelyn Whitemore was her opposite in every imaginable way. Born into wealth, Evelyn had never entered a room she wasn't welcomed into, never offered a hand that wasn't grasped eagerly. She had grown up in houses where ceilings stretched as high as the egos inside them, and where her family name was enough to silence any question of competence. When she inherited her father's construction empire, she refashioned herself as a visionary. She stood before cameras with rehearsed confidence, selling the story of innovation while others behind her carried the weight of actual ideas. To Evelyn, perception was reality. The right dress, the right sound bite, the right photograph could bend truth into admiration. It was a world she ruled comfortably, until her arrogance clashed with a truth she could not spin away. The deal that had brought these two women into the same room was no small feat, a $5 billion project meant to reimagine infrastructure across 3 states. It promised not only to bring jobs, but to transform the energy grid and modernize communities long left behind. Evelyn was the face of it, smiling from magazine covers and interviewed on national networks, but Lydia was the silent pulse, the one who had committed the capital that made the project credible. No investor of her stature was required to show up at a brunch, but Lydia had chosen to. Courtesy mattered to her, even when it was not returned. And when Evelyn's arrogance revealed itself in that refusal of a handshake, Lydia understood that courtesy without respect meant nothing at all. As Lydia returned to her car that morning, the sting of the snub pressed against her chest, but it was not humiliation she felt. It was something colder, sharper. A reminder that arrogance often carries the seeds of its own downfall. She thought of the executives who had looked away, of Richard Hale's fleeting glance of discomfort, of Olivia Reed's tightened jaw. None of them had spoken. Silence had filled that room, but Lydia knew silence could speak louder than any insult. And she had learned again and again how to turn silence into action. Meanwhile, Evelyn remained oblivious. She held court at the club, recounting her vision for the project, laughing with the men who fed her ego, reveling in the belief that she had once again proven herself untouchable. She never paused to consider the woman she had turned away from. She did not ask who Lydia Ellis was or why she had been there. In Evelyn's world, power had a face, and it was her own reflection. She could not imagine that the person she had dismissed could hold anything that might matter to her. But the balance was already shifting. That evening, when Evelyn sat for another interview and spoke about her commitment to progress, whispers had begun to ripple through her own company. Legal officers reread the contracts, noticing clauses that could be activated. Executives exchanged cautious messages, wondering if a storm was brewing. Olivia Reed, unable to shake the memory of Lydia's lowered hand, wrote a quiet note in her files. Review funding terms, urgent. It was the kind of note that suggested foresight, though she could not yet know how prescient it would be. Lydia, at home in her quiet study, did not rant or rage. She sat with her thoughts, replaying the moment not with pain but with clarity. The insult had not been new, but what she did next would be. She understood that dignity was not always in holding still. Sometimes it was in reminding others where the true lines of power were drawn. And for the first time, she considered whether Evelyn Whitemore's empire deserved the foundation she had given it. The night grew quiet, but Lydia's resolve did not. Beneath the hum of city lights, she began to weigh her choices. She knew what her absence would mean to the project, how quickly billions could unravel without her backing. The next morning, decisions would be made. Decisions Evelyn had never imagined possible. Morning light spilled across the city as if nothing had changed, but inside the walls of Whitemore Industries, unease had begun to take root. The grand project Evelyn Whitemore had plastered across billboards and broadcast studios depended on a fragile truth that only a few people fully understood. The money was not hers alone. The contracts had been carefully written, clauses tucked away in pages that most board members never read, but Lydia Ellis had read every word before she signed her name. And now, in the wake of that single humiliating moment, those words took on a different meaning. Evelyn entered her office that morning flushed with confidence, still replaying the brunch as if it had been another victory for her image. She spoke to her assistant about the press inquiries piling up, ordered fresh photographs for a magazine cover, and made plans to attend a gala where she would once again be paraded as the visionary of modern infrastructure. She was too consumed by her own reflection to notice the tension on her staff's faces, the quiet exchanges that ended abruptly when she entered the room. For Evelyn, the world revolved in her orbit, and she mistook compliance for admiration. But Lydia's silence the day before had not been submission. It was decision-making in motion. In her study that night, she had revisited the contract and the commitments she had made. She thought not of vengeance but of principle. If she allowed her investment to remain, if she looked away from Evelyn's arrogance, she would be complicit in rewarding disrespect with prosperity. Lydia had carried too many scars of dismissal to let this one pass. She could not undo centuries of prejudice with one act, but she could ensure that her money would never build a platform for arrogance draped in casual racism. By midday, the first ripples appeared. Richard Hale, head of legal, sat at his desk reviewing the terms when his eyes caught the clause that now seemed to burn on the page. Funding could be withdrawn within 24 hours at the investor's discretion. No penalty, no negotiation. The kind of clause that was overlooked when people assumed loyalty was guaranteed. His pulse quickened as he read it again, the reality dawning on him that the investor they had all but ignored had more control than the woman sitting in the highest chair of the company. He walked into a meeting with Evelyn and tried to raise the concern. "There's something we should discuss," he said carefully, but Evelyn brushed him off with a wave of her hand. She was too busy rehearsing her talking points for the evening news. "Don't bore me with paperwork, Richard," she said with that same dismissive laugh that had cut Lydia the day before. "Our investors know where their bread is buttered. They wouldn't dare walk away from something this big." But Richard's eyes darkened. He had seen the quiet steel in Lydia's composure, the way she had accepted humiliation without protest. It wasn't weakness. It was warning. At that same moment, Lydia sat in her office, her phone in hand, drafting an email with words sharper than any public rebuke. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't loud, but it was final. Her message was direct to the board. Effective immediately. Her funding was being withdrawn due to misconduct and unacceptable treatment of key personnel. She didn't embellish, didn't explain because she didn't need to. The truth of what had happened required no decoration. Dignity spoke best when it was uncluttered. Olivia Reed was among the first to see the email. She froze in her chair, her throat tightening as she read the words. She remembered Lydia's hand suspended in the air, the quick lowering of it, the silence that followed. She had wanted to speak then but hadn't. Now the consequence of that silence roared louder than any protest she might have made. She imagined Evelyn's reaction when she realized the woman she had dismissed was the very foundation of her empire. It would be disbelief at first, then panic, and finally, the crumbling of the arrogance that had once seemed indestructible. By afternoon, whispers spread beyond the office. Bank partners began to call, cautious and concerned. Suppliers wondered if the commitments they had been promised would hold. Even contractors in the field heard rumblings of a financial shift. The project Evelyn had wrapped herself in like a crown jewel suddenly seemed fragile, vulnerable. Her face still smiled from the evening news broadcast, speaking of innovation and unity, but behind closed doors, tension spread like cracks across glass. Lydia did not watch the news that evening. She sat with a cup of tea, her expression calm, her heart steady. She thought of her grandmother, a woman who had once been denied service at a diner and had walked out with her head high saying, "Respect isn't given, it's taken back when they try to strip it away." Lydia felt the same fire. She hadn't raised her hand for a handshake simply for herself. She had done it for every woman who had been overlooked, every voice silenced. And when that hand had been ignored, she knew what she had to do. Evelyn, oblivious, dined that night at a five-star restaurant, laughing with her entourage, already imagining the applause she would receive at the gala. She did not yet know that her empire was unraveling beneath her, not with a bang, not with a scandal in the tabloids, but with a quiet, deliberate decision typed into an email by the woman she had thought unworthy of a glance. And when the board awoke the next morning, when Richard Hale placed the letter on the polished oak table, there would be no more pretending. The truth was written plainly. Without Lydia Ellis, there was no deal. The consequence of arrogance was on its way, and Evelyn Whitemore had no idea that the silence she had dismissed would soon roar louder than all her cameras combined. The boardroom had never been so quiet. Morning sunlight streamed through the glass windows, spilling across the polished table where the executives of Whitemore Industries sat in uneasy silence. Papers that once carried the weight of billion-dollar dreams now felt like fragile scraps, meaningless without the signature that had given them value. Richard Hale's voice broke the silence at last, steady but heavy, as he read Lydia Ellis's letter aloud. The words were not long, nor were they dramatic, but their simplicity carried a devastating finality. Effective immediately, funding terminated, misconduct cited, obligations withdrawn. As the sound of his voice faded, the only thing left in the room was the echo of Lydia's decision. Evelyn Whitemore sat frozen in her seat, her hands gripping the armrests as though she might steady herself against a storm she could not control. Her face, usually sculpted into confidence for the cameras, had drained of color. For a long moment she said nothing, blinking as if the words might dissolve if she waited long enough. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked in a way that startled even her closest advisors. "How was I supposed to know who she was?" she whispered, as if ignorance might be a defense. But ignorance was no shield. Across the table, Olivia Reed stared at her with eyes sharp from guilt and anger. Olivia had seen the moment unfold, had felt her chest tighten when Lydia's hand hung in the air, and she had remained silent. Now, watching the empire unravel, she wished she had spoken, wished she had been the one to say the words Evelyn refused to hear. Respect cannot be selective. The weight of her own silence gnawed at her, but it was nothing compared to the reckoning Evelyn now faced. Stock analysts were already calling, their voices clipped, demanding explanations. Phones vibrated against the tabletop as messages poured in, contractors asking about stability, banks warning of reassessments, journalists requesting statements. The project Evelyn had boasted about on television just hours earlier was collapsing in real time. Investors whispered about pulling out, fearful of being tied to misconduct. The figure that had once seemed untouchable was now a liability, her name dragging down everything she touched. Richard Hale cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence again. She wasn't just an investor, he said, his voice low. She was the investor. $2 billion of capital vanished overnight. Without it, we don't have leverage, we don't have confidence, we don't have this deal. His words were not cruel, but the truth in them cut sharper than any blade. He had warned Evelyn, tried to raise the concern before, but she had laughed him off. Now the consequences were plain. Evelyn slammed her hand against the table, anger finally spilling where confidence had failed. I will fix this, she snapped, her voice trembling with desperation. She can't just walk away. She needs this project as much as we do. But the room remained still. No one nodded, no one echoed her claim. For the first time in her career, Evelyn looked around the table and saw not admiration, not fear, but doubt. It was the kind of doubt that could not be silenced with charm or brushed aside with wealth. Olivia finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. She doesn't need us, Evelyn. We needed her. And you showed her that you didn't even see her. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Evelyn flinched, her eyes narrowing as though she could glare the truth away, but she could not. The silence that followed was suffocating, a mirror of the silence that had filled the brunch hall when she refused that handshake. Except now, the silence was her own, imposed on her by the people who once would have shielded her. Outside the boardroom, the first articles had already begun to appear. Rumors spread that a major investor had withdrawn, and speculation about misconduct bubbled in the financial press. Though Lydia herself had declined to speak publicly, her absence spoke volumes. For every interview Evelyn tried to grant, for every statement her PR team rushed out, the unspoken truth remained louder. She had dismissed the wrong woman, and now her empire was paying the price. At home, Lydia watched none of it. She had no interest in Evelyn's panic, no desire to see the unraveling play out. Her decision was made, her capital already being redirected to another firm that valued inclusion, not as a slogan but as a practice. She felt no glee in Evelyn's downfall, no triumph in her silence. Instead, she felt the weight of dignity, the kind that had been tested and proven unshakable. The sting of that refused handshake had faded, replaced by a resolve that carried the strength of generations who had endured and endured, until the day came to quietly take back what was theirs. By evening, Evelyn sat alone in her office, the city skyline stretching beyond her windows, lights glittering like promises she could no longer keep. The laughter that had once filled her presence was gone. Even her closest allies had retreated, unwilling to stand beside her as the foundation of her empire cracked beneath her feet. She pressed her forehead into her hands, her shoulders trembling not with rage now but with the creeping realization that arrogance had cost her more than money. It had cost her everything she thought she controlled. The deal was shattered. The board had begun drafting exit strategies. Investors were calling in their lawyers. Whitemore Industries, once the pride of Evelyn's name, now carried a stain no amount of press could wash away. All of it traced back to a moment she had dismissed as nothing, a hand she refused to shake, a woman she refused to see. And though she tried to convince herself that she could repair it, somewhere in the quiet corners of her mind, Evelyn knew the truth. Empires don't always fall from fire and scandal. Sometimes they collapse from silence. Silence returned in equal measure to the disregard that built them. The days that followed were a blur of headlines, phone calls, and failed attempts at recovery. Evelyn Whitemore, once the darling of every business magazine, found her face splashed across newspapers for reasons she had never anticipated. Empire in jeopardy, one headline read. Another was even sharper. Funding withdrawn after disrespect. The media never named Lydia Ellis, But the whispers traveled fast in the industry. Everyone with influence soon knew the truth. The woman Evelyn had dismissed so casually was the one who had held the lifeline of the project. And though Evelyn tried to control the narrative with interviews and apologies, every word sounded hollow. No one believed in her charm anymore. She had exposed herself, and the world saw arrogance where it once saw power. The board of directors no longer looked at her with admiration. They looked at her with thinly veiled resentment, as if her downfall had become a burden they were all forced to carry. Olivia Reed, who had once remained quiet, now spoke firmly in meetings. "We should have seen this coming," she said, her voice sharp with the guilt of someone who had witnessed the moment and done nothing. "Respect isn't a courtesy. It's the foundation we stand on. Without it, none of this means anything." Her words stung because they were true. Evelyn had built her empire on the illusion of strength, but illusions vanish quickly when tested by the simplest of truths. Lydia, meanwhile, remained absent from the public storm. She refused interviews, declined all invitations to speak, and gave no explanation beyond the one already written in her letter. Instead, she redirected her energy and her resources. The billions she had withdrawn from Whitemore Industries did not sit idle. They flowed quietly into the hands of another firm, one that had built its reputation not on spectacle but on integrity. Where Evelyn had dismissed her with a glance, this new partnership welcomed her as an equal, valuing not just her capital but her vision. It was not revenge that motivated Lydia. It was purpose. Her choice was not about tearing Evelyn down, but about lifting others up. Yet the emotional weight of the moment lingered. In private, Lydia allowed herself to remember the sting of that day, the way her hand had hung in the air, the way the silence of the room had pressed down around her. She remembered her grandmother's voice, steady and unbroken after a lifetime of being overlooked. "When they won't take your hand, keep it steady. One day, they'll know what it means to have missed it." Lydia felt the truth of those words more deeply now than ever. The insult had not destroyed her. It had defined her next step. And in choosing dignity over anger, she had reminded the world that silent power is still power. For Evelyn, the silence was unbearable. Each day she watched as more investors distanced themselves, as partners sought new ventures, as her carefully crafted image crumbled into dust. She gave statements filled with regret, spoke of misunderstandings, tried to frame herself as a victim of confusion. But her words fell flat because the truth was written in the simplicity of her action. She had seen a black woman and dismissed her. No apology could erase that truth. And the world finally was unwilling to excuse it. Inside her office, Evelyn stared at the skyline that had once seemed to bow before her. Now it loomed like a judgment. She thought of that brunch again and again, replaying the moment she turned her back. It had felt so small then, a nothing gesture. But the smallest acts reveal the deepest truths, and that truth had cost her everything. She pressed her hands to her face, wishing she could rewrite the moment, but time does not bend for regret. The project did not die completely. Months later, under new leadership and with Lydia's backing redirected to another firm, it moved forward without Evelyn's name attached. It became a symbol of progress, of integrity, of what could be achieved when respect guided ambition. But Evelyn herself was left in the shadows, her reputation scarred beyond repair. She was a reminder of what happens when arrogance blinds the eyes and prejudice silences the hand. And Lydia, true to her nature, did not gloat. She did not boast about her role in Evelyn's downfall. She moved forward with quiet determination, proving that the most powerful voice does not always shout. It is steady, deliberate, and unshaken by arrogance. She knew there would always be more battles to fight, more moments where dignity would be tested. But she also knew that this moment had been more than personal. It had been a reminder for everyone watching that respect is not optional, and the price of arrogance can be measured in billions. For those who had witnessed the brunch, the image of Lydia's lowered hand lingered long after the empire crumbled. It haunted them because it was so simple, so human, and yet so heavy with meaning. It was the image of a world where some still believed power had a face, a color, a pedigree. And it was the image of that belief being shattered in silence. Dear audience, if this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the power of dignity and the cost of arrogance. Give this story a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that reveal the truths too often left in silence. And tell us, where are you watching from today? Because stories like this remind us that power is not in the noise, but in the quiet moments that change everything. If this story made you stop and think about the real cost of arrogance, don't just move on. Give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss the next powerful story. And tell me this in the comments. Do you believe one single moment, like a handshake refused, can change the course of an entire empire? I'd love to hear your thoughts.